Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you diddling, Ken?
Exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 269, and three stops on today's journey, starting with theory and practice, where we're going to be speaking all things compassion fatigue. Moving on to practice today. What do you do when a client ghosts you, doesn't return, doesn't come back, doesn't turn up for the first session, leaves you there? Where are you? How do you feel? What can we do? And then in Practice Matters, that is our CPD section. Today we're going to be looking at hunger and strokes from transactional analysis. But straight into the theory and practice, we're diving in, Rory, to compassion fatigue. What's that?
Well, I mean, I guess it could be summed up neatly as empathy failure, where you can no longer empathise with somebody, where you struggle to see someone else's frame of reference. In some cases, where you get, angry and aggravated by someone's position in the world and think to yourself, why can't they just help themselves? The answer to this is simple. And that is compassion fatigue. It's something that happens to professionals sometimes very early on in the career, and we're talking about students. Possibly people have got very busy lives. I mean, both of us did a diploma in counselling, and you know how disruptive to our lives that was. And we have other things going on, and I've known students get compassion fatigue. They're struggling with stuff in their life, and they're getting through it. They meet a client who is struggling with the same kind of things who isn't. And it's like, well, why can't they do what I did? And eventually what happens is you become less compassionate, less empathic.
I guess when I think compassion, it calls us into counselling, a level of compassion, that level of empathy to be there in service of others. But the truth is, it can be heavy material that we're working with day in and day out. And I guess compassion fatigue for me is a dulling of that empathic chisel with which we kind of go into the client's material. It dulls down. It can be we've heard it so many times, it can be a self-protection, as you've mentioned, Rory. Maybe there's a parallel in one's own life or an area that we want to avoid, but it's us not being able to be fully empathic with the person who is in front of us. We're dulled to it. And I guess it makes sense in a way that we would have this mechanism as biological creatures, that if we were dealing with these traumatic stories on a day-to-day basis, that we would have some form of adaptation that would kind of make us less open to feeling that hurt or I guess experiencing that with other people. I can understand why it's there, but I can also understand the dangers of compassion fatigue. And I guess I'm thinking of an ER, an emergency room, where emergency people are brought in all the time. And within that environment, people have maybe been in a horrific situation. They could be coming in mangled, lots of blood and gore kind of thing. And you would want, I guess, it's interesting when you see it on the television, the professionals in that situation haven't got the time to be freaked out by that. They have to have a desensitivity to that to be able to do their job properly. And I think the opposite is true in counselling and psychotherapy. We need to be attuned. We need to be there. We need to be listening and standing next to the client and being empathic in order to do our job. So it's almost the opposite.
Yeah, and I think that with great respect to medics, they're almost like mechanics. They're interested in repairing you.
Yes.
And I had a really interesting conversation with someone many years ago whose husband was a doctor and she was very ill. And the doctor, her husband, insisted on getting involved in the case and directing things. He had an expertise, luckily, in what she was ill at. But however, what it left her with was the fact that he'd been more interested in repairing her than how she felt afterwards. And his response was, I saved your life. I saved your life. I literally repaired you, which was true. But for her, the thing was that he wasn't engaging in how she felt afterwards. And I think that's a good kind of example of what can happen. And I'm sure that medics are compassionate people. They must see pain. But, you know, on a kind of procedural level, they're there to try and cure, repair. And therapists can get to a point where they burn out. They get things like a loss of energy or be very cynical in the work. Or sometimes it's just a dread of working with certain clients. You know, I've you know, certainly as a supervisor, I've heard people say, oh, it's someone coming in with grief again. And I'm going, oh, hold on, let's just have a look at that. Can we just rewind? It's someone coming in with grief again. It's just another can of beans, is it? Well, no. So why is that giving you difficulty? And also, I think one of the things that really kind of highlights compassion fatigue is difficulty separating work life from personal life. Yeah. I think where you can't separate what's going on in your client work from your own life, that is a sure sign of compassion fatigue.
Yeah, and talking about the signs and symptoms, and you've touched on a few there, and looking at the handout here, quoting from the handout that we'll share where you can get that in a moment on compassion fatigue. In compassion fatigue, there's a significant shift in the way the affected person sees the world. And so that would be the therapist, experience compassion fatigue, and it will be invisible to the therapist. It's not seen. It's unlikely you're going to go, oh, I'm feeling a little bit of compassion fatigue here. It's going to be your world and how you see it. So we look out for signs, and we look out for signs such as negative thinking, difficult emotions that may be coming up, irrational fears, intrusive imagery. And one of the things that was interesting for me is either a hypersensitivity or an insensitivity to the emotional material. So it's not just that compassion fatigue blunts, so therefore the material doesn't affect the therapist. It can be a hypersensitivity to the information that is being shared as well. It's both sides of that. Loss of energy, like you've already said, Rory, you know, I've got 5 clients today. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
5. Oh, dear, it's this one. I don't want to see that one coming in. Or being too excited about another one that might be coming in. Yeah. Another client that may become dreading working with certain clients and being overly optimistic about working with others. And, of course, that reduced ability to feel that empathic connection. And of course, we talk, and then maybe that would lead to self-judgment. Oh, I'm not doing it right. I need to try harder. I need to be there more for my clients. Yeah. I guess a way of watching out for this would be supervision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good supervisor's radar will always be scanning the horizon for compassion fatigue. And that's why regular supervision is such an essential element. When I worked in offender services, I used to be a housing support, key worker. We had very little supervision, and I watched people literally compassion fatigue literally disappear within a few weeks. And that's because there was no one there to say to them, look, do you not think you're getting too involved in this?
Yeah.
And, I saw people go sick. I saw people have nervous breakdowns. I saw people speak very harshly to the residents, people who lived in the supported housing. And it was all a sign of compassion fatigue. And it can affect us all. Don't think it won't happen to me. It can happen to you. And sometimes it's a very gradual decline. It starts off with, maybe, why can't this person help themselves? Well, if they could do that, they wouldn't be coming to see you as a therapist, would they? That's the first question.
Yeah.
If they could sort it out themselves, they probably would have done. And, as a supervisor, I would be clear with a supervisor if I thought that was the case. And I'd also say, let's have a look at a plan to try and reduce this. And this might be reducing your client load.
Yes.
Might be reducing your client load and putting more emphasis on self-care, which I remind my supervisees on a regular basis is an ethical imperative. It's in ethical frameworks. Self-care is important just for this thing, to prevent compassion fatigue or burnout.
Yeah, or even stepping out of practice, if warranted, stepping out of practice for a while to focus on that self-care. Supervision is so important. It really, really is, and it helps us better carry that our clients bring to us. We're taking it to another human, and we get to share it, and we get another set of eyes looking over that with us. And as you've mentioned, Rory, in some areas where there are individuals working with heavy material, like, as you said, in care work, without supervision, so often those service workers are criticized and brought to book and make newspaper headlines for ways that they have behaved, ways that they have interacted. And I have no doubt that at the seed of that was a caring, wanting to make a difference when it all started off. But the day-to-day, with no release of the pressure that builds up. I'm thinking of those pressure cookers that have got the little thing on the top. When there's no release for that pressure, it's got to have an effect somewhere down the train, or it can have an effect somewhere down the chain, and it I guess becomes bad service provision, and in some cases dangerous service provision.
Absolutely can. And when I was a support worker, I used to take my client load to my clinical supervisor. I paid out of my very meagre earnings, I have to say, for monthly supervision, so that I could talk about client work, and because I understood, being a therapist first and foremost, the importance of supervision, where a lot of my colleagues had come into the work without having gone through the kind of route I took. But yeah, I mean, supervision was mainly, in my experience, managerial. It was, how many rooms are occupied?
Yeah.
Are people paying the rents? It would focus more on the business element of the organisation than it did actually on caring for the people who were there. And it was a surprise. It was a bit of a culture shock. And also, I think as professionals, we do have a duty of candour. I think if we see it in others, we should talk to that person, initially as a critical friend, and say, look, this is what I'm hearing, and I'm just a little bit worried about you. And if that continues, and you're really worried about someone's practice, I think you've really got a duty to take that further, Ken.
I agree with you. I do. I think supervision, peers, looking out, having that candour, as we're called for, which is called for in most ethical frameworks, candour, and self-care, personal development, knowing yourself, and keeping an eye out for it's almost that internal supervisor, or keeping an eye out for, I don't know, you sat with a client and all of a sudden anger starts coming up because they're bringing the same thing they brought last week and the week. There's compassion fatigue. It's showing itself. What do? Not hide it and go, oh, I shouldn't be thinking this. I shouldn't be feeling like this. We take it to supervision. We go and we get it out. We talk about it. We put it into the light, because when we shine a light on it, we can do something about it. When we keep it in the dark, that's when it grows. That's when it goes unchecked. And there's some big risks at the end of this. So we're talking about particular risk factors for developing compassion fatigue. And you've used 3 in the handout that we're going to share in the moment. One, I'm not even going to give too much on this because I want you to go and get this handout and go and have a look at it. One is the Messiah complex. It's the I can fix this problem, make everybody okay. I'm going to fix the world, save the world. The other one is the Lone Ranger complex. I know that I know what I'm getting into. I can handle it on my own. I'm okay. I don't need a supervisor. I can see these feelings come and go, but what I'll do is I'll do a bit of self-care and journaling and I'll be all right with this. And then the same complex. It's all right. I believe that my faith in this model and what I'm doing, it's going to carry me through. I can deal with all the stress of working with suffering people. I'll be all right, the same complex. It's worth having a look at those because all 3 of those, when they hit the client, when it's client facing, when the client is receiving their service, it is not in service of the client. It really is not. And it is a result of a very real risk of compassion fatigue.
It is. And from a client's point of view, I remember reading, I think it was in the Times many years ago, about a guy in America who's paying for therapy. And every time he go and see his therapist, the therapist would say, well, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Well, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And eventually he thinks, I'm paying $50 an hour for this. $50 an hour. He said, I'd have a big omelette. And the point was that the person was just going through the motions, partly listening. And I would think that would indicate compassion fatigue. Someone who's just counselling by the numbers, saying the right things, the odd reflection and paraphrase, as opposed to being really integrative in integrating in the relationship, forming, that empathic attunement that is so important in our work. And it does happen. And I think, we shouldn't blame people if they do get compassion fatigue, because ours is a very demanding practice. It's a very demanding piece of work. We work at the sharpy, pointy end of people's lives, and we see it all. Yeah. We see it all. And, sometimes my wife will watch a program on the TV about someone being unkind to someone, and I'll say, I'm just going to go and read a book. And she'll say, do I watch this? I'll say, no, yeah. I've seen enough of that in my own life. Thank you. I don't want to watch it on TV. Because I know that what will happen is I will start to engage empathically with the character. And that would give me some difficulty. I want to save my energies up, and put in some self-protection. So, yeah, if you are, if you download this handout and you think, well, that's me, don't give yourself a hard time. Think about your next plan. Think about your next move, supervision, and look after yourself, because it impacts, I think, as much on the client as it does on the therapist, or as much on the therapist as it does on the client. It's a two-way thing.
Oh, very much so. Compassion for self-care, supervision, all there for you. We've got a handout. Rory has made a really nice handout for you. Where do you get it? You go to counsellingtutor.com. Top of the website page, you're going to see a little menu. Click on the podcasts tab and find your way to episode 269. That's today's episode. And you can download right from that very page a really nice, well laid out, well researched, citable document on compassion fatigue for counsellors. It's written for us. Stages of compassion fatigue are in there as well, starting off with engagement, upset, disturbance, irritability, withdrawing, quitting, and the pathology versus renewal. It's really interesting stuff. Whether qualified or a student, you're going to want to have this. Counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab, episode 269. Go and get it. That has been Theory in Practice. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. Moving from theory and practice, we go into practice today. That's when we look at something that is contemporary, something that's going on right now, something that you are discussing and speaking about. And today we're talking about when a client ghosts you, Rory? What is ghosting?
Well, a ghosting is where you effectively disappear off someone's radar. You don't, you never write, you never call, you never respond. You just effectively disappear. And I was drawn to this topic because one of the best books I ever read was by a guy called Stephen Gross, called The Examine Life, How We Lose and Find Ourselves. And I think it should be a book that everybody should read. And actually, I had some correspondence with Stephen many years ago. And he was delightful. He was a lovely man. And if anybody knows him now, because I haven't got his email address, I'd love to interview him again for the podcast. I really would, because the insights in this book are phenomenal. And he speaks of a client, and I think the client was called Peter. And he was working with his client, and one day he didn't turn up. And then a few months later, he got a message from his fiancée saying he'd died. And that was the end of that. I guess he wrote his notes up. This isn't in the book, but he would have wrote his notes up and kind of reflected, I guess, and moved on. A few years later, he was at a theatre and he bumped into the client. He bumped into the client who died.
Whoops.
And from what I remember, they re-engaged in therapy. And it just goes to prove that sometimes clients don't tell us everything about themselves. I mean, that is a very extreme case, saying someone's died. But I think it's a lesson in the fact that when we engage with clients, we may not know who they are. And in some cases, they just don't come back. And, certainly as a supervisor, I've had many supervisees sit in front of me saying, I don't know what I did wrong. It was going so well. We were really getting into the material. The relationship felt so okay. They were okay. And then I sat there on Thursday afternoon. They didn't turn up. So as in the contract, I dropped them an email. They never responded. Mm-hmm. I don't know what happened. And, that could be sometimes tough because what's happening is that emotional investment that the therapist has put in to the client has kind of just been, I don't know, it just disappears, it evaporates. People can feel empty, and there's a great sense of loss that goes along with it. And it's happened to us all, Ken. It's happened to me. I know it's happened, I'm guessing, and it's happened to you in your practice.
Yes.
Clients don't come back. It's something where we just have to live with. It's part of the job.
Yeah. It's either happened or it's going to happen. And that's the truth of it. This definitely does happen. When you were explaining it in the beginning, I think of how many times, maybe before I did my studies in counselling, I would maybe go to a restaurant window and start reading the menu, and maybe somebody would come out and say, oh, can I help you? Would you like us to book you a table? And I'd be reading the menu and I'd go, oh no, but I love your menu and I will definitely come here at lunch. I have no intentions of going in there. Like I say, this is a less congruent me from some years back. But it's the same kind of thing. We can have clients saying one thing to kind of make us feel okay, but we don't know what's going on for them. And it's their journey. We need to remember that. It's their journey and it's their choice whether they come back or not. But it can leave us with feelings. Did I say something wrong? Did I do something wrong? Are they okay? Maybe they've been in an accident. It's all, maybe they didn't get my email. Maybe they didn't get my text. Maybe they didn't get the reminder. Maybe the buses are running late. So we start examining, what did I do? Where have I gone wrong with this? And I think that is the part we need to focus on, is what comes up in us. And once again, Rory, just like our last topic, this is about supervision.
Oh gosh, absolutely, Ken. I mean, it lives in supervision, and I find that the majority of people who bring this to supervision have a strong sense of loss, have a sense of guilt that, I was thinking maybe I shouldn't have used that question, or I reflected something back and they looked a bit shocked when I reflected that back. And I wonder if and the self-flagellation is terrible to see. And as a supervisor, in some cases I've just said, because that's kind of how I do my supervision, enough, stop it, just enough.
Yeah.
What we know is the client hasn't come back for reasons that you may never know. And, it may be that they just decided not to have therapy anymore. That's their right. But this overanalyzing of what's happened isn't doing you any good. You're the person who sat in front of me, and I think that's important. And I think if there's anybody listening out there who's gone through this, or you may listen to this and say, "Well, that happened to me last week." Don't give yourself a hard time. It's client's choice whether they come back or not, and sometimes, life gets in the way of people. They may not be able to afford therapy. They may not be able to afford the time for therapy. They may find that what's been uncovered or what they're talking about is so powerful that they can't handle it. I've known that, where and they've said, I just don't think I can do this, and they've left, and you just know they're not going to come back. And I can remember many years ago when I was at Mind in the old building in Ashton, which was like an elastic place. It was an old creaky building, the floors creaked, and such fond memories of my early time as a placement therapist. And I remember one of the more experienced therapists. She was a psychoanalytical therapist, and she was a really considered person, stood at the window looking out. And I remember it was a rainy window. It was raining and you couldn't see out. And I said, "You all right?" And she said, "Yeah, my client hasn't arrived now. I wonder what's going on for that person." And you could see she was she kind of got lost in it,
Yeah.
And I never asked her because I was like a junior therapist. It wasn't for me to speak, sort of thing. But I often wondered, if she'd given a bit too much of herself, and how she processed that in supervision, because it was almost like a longing as she looked out the window, hope she might spot him, hope she might find him.
Yeah.
And while that's very touching, I'm not sure how healthy that is in the long run.
Yeah, and thinking about it, I mean, I think the spiky end of this is that imposter syndrome. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe they're leaving because I, as the counsellor, am failing them. It's an interesting topic. We've got an article on our website at Counselling Tutor talking about something called the black hole effect, which is the same kind of phenomenon, but it's John Suler who kind of looked into this, looking at how this affects online working, because it can happen online where you're with a client and you're there on a telephone call, or you might be in a video using televideo software, and they can either not come back or they can just disappear halfway through a session, which is less likely when in the room. If somebody was going to disappear halfway through a session, we would kind of know about it. But I guess it could happen in a room. Somebody could say, "Could I excuse myself to go to the loo," and not come back, And it's about us recognizing that is their 100% right. It really is their 100% right. So I guess we prepare for this in if you're running a practice with our cancellation policy and payment policy is one area that we might look at if somebody doesn't come, to make sure that we don't, to make sure that the management of our practice continues. We would cover it there. So that's the mechanics of it. But how do we cover it with our own selves when it's happened to us, when we start feeling those feelings, when we, like that colleague of yours that you shared, Rory, of we're kind of staring off into the distance and we're wondering, and I guess we're fantasizing of what might be going on here, and most noticeably what my role in that might have been and how I might have caused that. I think that's the area to look at. That's the area to start journaling about, speaking to your peers about, asking, has it ever happened to you? And of course, get into your supervisor and speak about it there.
Absolutely. And I think it's about being realistic.
Yeah.
This is a realistic part of the work. And it's not, it's not to be taken too personally, although it can feel a bit personal. It's just what happens, and if you're a therapist for long enough, you're going to have clients that don't come back, and when you email them, ghost you. And, there's a lot of conversations about them not paid as well. And when I write to them, we never hear anything. And I think sometimes you just have to take that as part of the territory. It can be an expensive lesson as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Rory, for bringing the topic. Actually, you know what? Thank you, Rory, for listening to our audience and bringing the topic, because it's you, our audience, that sets these topics. Get into the Facebook group, putting counselling in Facebook, put Counselling Tutor in and come and join our group, because this is where these discussions are held, and you're welcome to take part in them and suggest topics that you'd like to hear in practice today. So moving out of practice today into Practice Matters, the CPD section today, Rory, TA, hungers and strokes.
Yes, it's always a pleasure to hear one of my colleagues in the transactional analysis or psychoanalytical modality talk about some of the theory. And I caught up with Lisa Mathurin, who's talked about specific theory in transactional analysis called hungers and strokes, talking about a lecture she has in our CSR library, our library for students. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
TA theory has been a cornerstone of psychotherapeutic interventions since the 1970s. So I'm delighted to welcome back Lisa Mathurin, who is a TA therapist, and she's going to talk about a lecture she has done for the CSR library on hungers and strokes. So Lisa, welcome.
Thank you, Rory. Good to be here.
So, on the face of it, hungers and strokes, it sounds terribly exciting. So, if we just look at hungers first, in terms of TA theory, and I guess the human condition, what are hungers?
Well, Eric Byrne, the founder of TA theory, he identified the hungers as fundamental drives that kind of motivate our behaviour in a similar way to actually feeling hungry. If you are hungry, you're motivated to go and find food. So you find the food to meet that hunger. And these are psychological hungers. So we're not talking about biology here. We're talking about psychological. So it's all kind of mental and kind of in the brain. But at the very young age that we become aware of them, they hold the same importance to our survival as food does. So to that child, they are really hungry. They're starving for one of the hungers that he identified. And I think it's important as practitioners that we realise that in those very early development years, they are important to our well-being as food is to our survival.
I think that's a very interesting observation, because TA theory is rooted really in childhood development and the arc of development through, I guess, birth into adulthood, and it focuses on the presenting past. I've always been told, I'm not a TA therapist by any stretch of the imagination, but those pals of mine who are, those friends of mine who are, say that in the therapy room the presenting past comes in. In other words, things that haven't been assuaged or rectified in childhood repeat as patterns in our adult life. So if we're thinking about the child's experience initially, what kind of a hunger would a child learn to have? What would be missing out of a child's life that these hungers, these psychological hungers, start to develop?
You're spot on. TA does kind of focus very much on that child development, and I think we know, those of us that are qualified and in training, how important those developmental years are to our presentation today. And attachment theory is a very good representation of that. Byrne came up with 6 original hungers, and I'm thinking the ones that you could probably make quite a easy connection to those developmental years are things like, he talks about stimulus hunger, so the need for stimulation, recognition hunger, the attention from others. So if you have a child that has not been recognised or validated during their developmental years, they may hunger for the attention. And I think sometimes in managing behaviours in children, you often see a child that might be acting out and has the label of being badly behaved. I always think, what are they hungry for? What do they need? Because by acting out, they get attention, or it might be negative attention, but they still get that attention. So is there a recognition hunger there? Do they need to be seen?
Yes. I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And you talked about obviously the hunger of being touched, and that could be a child being nursed or held, or if they're upset, just comforted, and also being validated in the world that you are a person, you're a person of value, a little person of value. You're a little person if you're a child, but you are a person of value. And sadly, and you're right in terms of attachment theory and the way we attach, that vitamin isn't always there in parental-child relationships. So I guess what I'm hearing is that lack of stimulus, that lack of recognition, then builds into the arc of someone's life. And as they move across into adulthood, that is still very much present for them.
Yes, definitely. And I think one of the benefits of kind of Byrne laying out these individual hungers is you can kind of see where the deficits are, because there has to be a balance, because one is not enough. Just being seen is not enough if there's no structure in your life or there's no contact in your life. It's about, like you wouldn't, I don't know, if you were hungry, you wouldn't overdose on one food. You need a balanced diet to meet the hunger. And it's the same with Byrne's hungers. It's getting a balance across the board, really.
Yeah, it's consistency, isn't it?
Consistency, definitely.
In how, because as humans, we tend to like consistency with pattern matching devices to a great extent. Humans. Yeah. So I guess that brings us on then to the stroke economy and the work of Claude Steiner. And for those who are listening who are not sure of the work of Claude Steiner, I think I'm right in saying, again, not my area of expertise, but Claude Steiner had a specific school within TA, and part of that was recognising and I guess assuaging that hunger by what might be called strokes. Perhaps you could better articulate it, Lisa.
Yeah. So, I mean, strokes was originally picked up by Byrne, but Steiner, who was friends with Byrne, they kind of worked together, kind of ran with it with his warm fuzzy towel, which I can kind of talk about a bit more in a minute. But strokes are defined as a unit of recognition, and they are really crucial in meeting the demand of the hunger, especially the recognition and the stimulus hunger, and also in the structure. I think people underestimate the importance of structure that we have in our lives. And one of the examples I always use in my teaching is Christmas is a fine example of when the structure goes out the window and we don't know what day it is or, what we're doing. And so that structure is really kind of important. And if we don't have that structure, say if you grew up in a chaotic household, you might yearn for some sort of organization. So strokes can be positive and negative. They can be conditional or unconditional, and they can be verbal or non-verbal. And there's different types, like they can be live-in, so in the here and now, or they can be direct, indirect. It's all in the lecture about the kind of different types of strokes we have. But unfortunately, due to our experience in our developmental years, we also can develop a stroke filter. So if we don't have experience of receiving positive strokes, then we find it very hard to accept those. So people might recognize that in taking a compliment. They might feel uncomfortable or discount a compliment. So we can filter strokes out.
Yeah.
As well. And Steiner came up with the whole stroke economy idea where he said that on average, we don't ask for the strokes that we want, and we don't accept the strokes that we get. And so his kind of philosophy was to challenge that and ask for the strokes we want, accept the strokes we're given. Stroke ourselves, as in how often do we celebrate our achievements? In our culture, it's in this country, it's kind of portrayed as being I don't know, big-headed or arrogant.
Yes.
If you say, I'm great at this. Well, if you're great at it, you're great at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's wrong with saying that?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, obviously we record the podcast in the UK, and there's a certain culture within the UK, and certainly I'm from the north of England, and growing up, I would have been told, don't get too big-headed or your cap won't fit.
Oh, okay.
No letters, please, from northern people who say we don't wear flat caps. You're stereotyping us. But as I grew up, that would have been in the language of conversation, and it was like, don't get too big-headed.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm hearing is that sometimes it's a permission for someone to say, I just need some recognition here. I just need someone to know me in the world and recognise who I am and maybe what I do.
And I think, I just went to person-centred theory there about the internal and external locus of evaluation.
Yes.
And I was just thinking, so many of us are dependent on that external validation, aren't we? And whereas really we know for a sense of okayness, it needs to come from within. We need to connect with ourselves, know our worths, know our value. And that includes celebrating our achievements, which really most of the time we've worked quite hard for.
Yes.
It's not like they've just fallen in our lap and like, oh, I'm great because I'm lucky, or, we've worked really hard for these achievements. So what's wrong with celebrating that and validating ourselves and developing our internal locus of valuation?
Yeah, I like that link to person-centered theory. And I guess the other link would be the relationship, because I guess a therapist may very well reflect back to a client that, you've told me that you're very successful at this, and people are telling you how accomplished you are. Would that count as part of the stroke economy as they've talked about?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, Rory, because I think as a TA therapist, one of our jobs is to be congruent in delivering positive strokes to our clients and challenging that negative frame of reference they have about how they see their self or what their value or worth is. And I think, by saying, wow, that's fantastic. What a great job you did, or that's kind of conditional because it's on what they did.
Yes.
An unconditional example would be, you are amazing.
Yes.
Full stop. You are amazing.
Yeah.
And sometimes clients don't hear that from other people.
No.
They don't get stroked by other people. They don't get that external validation, which then reinforces their internal process.
Yes.
So it's not about them becoming dependent on the therapist to give them their strokes, and it's about modeling. It's okay to celebrate. It's okay to think we're wonderful. And
yes, it's about eliciting a permission in the therapy room, isn't it? Where the client can say, can forget about the cap not being too small for the head, and saying, I'm really good at this, and I've done this and I've done that, and the therapist might go, wow, incredible.
Yeah, and humans are amazing. We are amazing, aren't we? So I don't think there's anything wrong in saying, I've worked hard for this, I've done well, or I'm a kind person, or I'm a caring person, and owning that quality.
Yes.
And celebrating that quality.
Yeah. So let's have no more sayings of, don't boast too much or your cat won't fit. I don't think you'd hear that.
No.
I don't think you'd hear that too much, even in Manchester anymore. But and I guess one of the things that's really interested me in the course of our kind of dialogue is that we managed to span two modalities of therapy, transactional analysis and person-centered therapy, because there's such a common language here, isn't there?
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons, why I'm so passionate about TA is that it is so usable. and I see it every conversation I have, every person I meet. I don't psychoanalyze everybody I meet, but I can see, I can see TA living within the interactions.
Yes.
And I can relate it to person-centered. I can relate it to CBT. I can relate it to psychodynamic. I think it's all interconnected, because I think at the end of the day, what therapy is about is the facilitation of change in another.
Yes.
And all of the modalities that's kind of a common goal. So I think that's where we all overlap.
Absolutely. And sometimes one of the things I've learned through the years is that, psychotherapeutic language is sometimes interchangeable when we talk about, conditions of worth and interjective values. In TA, we might talk about injunctions and drivers.
Injunctions, yeah.
And they mean broadly. I mean, if you get to the analysis of it, they are different. There's some striking differences, but there's a heck of a lot of similarities. And
yes.
I guess if you're out there and you're a student, you're writing a lecture, you might want to replay that bit and use it in your assignment, because there is a lot of overlap. Finally, I wonder what you hope that those who watch your lecture may take away from it, Lisa.
What I would hope is that they would be able to understand the different hungers and the different strokes, because there are different types, and also for support in personal development. So next time you go to the fridge and you open the fridge and it's full of food, and you look in there and you think, I don't know what I fancy, ask yourself, are you actually hungry? Are you physically hungry? Do you have hunger pains, or are you hungering for something else? Do you need something else? And it might be recognition or structure. You might be bored. So kind of to then translate that to our clients. When you have a client, when you're working with a client and they're sitting in front of you, what are they hungry for? Yeah. What do they need?
Well,
and also celebrate yourself. Stroke yourself. That's what I'd hope.
There we have it. Lisa Mathurin's lecture on hungers and strokes within TA theory is available now in the CSR library, and it just goes for me to say thank you so much for joining us again.
Big thank you to Lisa. Big thank you to you, Rory, for holding that interview, bringing us that information. And if you want to hear Lisa's lecture, you're a student of counselling. She has a string of lectures that she's done for us in our student library, all on transactional analysis. A nice deep dive, of course, this one on hungers and strokes, but other ones as well, really covering TA in some detail. If you're a member of the Counsellor CSR, the Counselling Study Resource, as we call it, just log in and you will find that there. If you're not a member, just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there on our homepage. This has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 269, Rory.
It is, and we started with theory and practice, talking about compassion fatigue and how it might affect students who have for the first time experienced this. In practice today, we talked about when a client ghosts you, does not return or turn up for the first or subsequent sessions, what may that feel like, and what is the reality of being a practitioner where clients sometimes don't reattend or attend at all. And then in Practice Matters, the wonderful Lisa Mathurin talking about a lecture she's just given for the CSR library, transactional analysis, hungers and strokes. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.